Train wrecks, boat wrecks, tragedy. It is all over the place in the song we are talking about this week. You know it well. We all know it. It's one of the more popular hymns out there. It's a song of great comfort written by people that had suffered an enormous amount of tragedy. This week on Talking Hymns, we're dealing with It Is Well With My Soul. Well, Tim.
Well, Shane.
Another week, another one of these hymns that seems to have more twists and turns. It is a story stranger than fiction. It is well with my soul.
Absolutely. Yeah. And many times people have heard the story, but I guess when you revisit it and dig a little bit deeper and see there's even background to the background,
yes,
like we discovered.
Yes.
The man Horatio Spafford, who wrote the text, one of my hymnology people that I researched called him the Job of his time because of the misfortunes that had followed him.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be a fair description. Let's anchor this thing in history. We're talking of gentleman Horatio Gates Spafford. Wasn't known as a hymn writer, was just a faithful lawyer and Presbyterian elder in Chicago, Illinois. And that's kind of, let's set the scene. He was a lawyer. He was a man that was doing quite well.
Invested wisely in real estate.
But as you might remember, in 1871, there seemed to be, as we remember from history, an enormous, awful fire in Chicago. As someone who has lived in Chicago for a period of time, it's interesting to recognize certain neighborhoods that were drastically shaped by the fire. If you've ever been to Chicago, things like Grants Park and things like that never would have existed if it wasn't for the fire, because they literally just bulldozed portions of the city, shoved it into the lake, and created new property. But there's also neighborhoods that have these strange ground level units that are actually subterranean. It's because the ash and the construction basically is just piled up on parts of the city. But he was someone, Horatio Spafford was someone who owned a lot of land and property and lost it in the fire.
And of course, losing the property meant he lost his money. Yep. I mean, he was pretty destitute after that.
Yeah, and so where this story and this hymn begins to take shape is on the tail end of that.
Well, we want to back up and talk about...
Yeah, let's back up a little bit,
A little bit before the fire.
Yes, that's true.
He lost one of his children. One of his sons died. Infant death. Not infant death, but he died very young.
So he had 5 children. One of them dies, has 4 remaining with his wife. I believe it's Anna, right?
Sounds good.
Yes. Yep, Anna.
Okay, we'll call her Anna.
Yeah. Yes. And so that's happening. And so that happens the fire happens in 1871. And where this story begins to sort of take its genesis is in 1873. He's beginning to recover with that. He's made a connection with the famous Chicago evangelist D.L. Moody, and so you want to fill us in a little bit what happens here?
A little hazy. He's not a musician. That is, Spafford, but he was evidently involved in the whole Moody ministry. And Moody decided to take his show on the road, so to speak, wanted to take it to England and wanted Spafford to help him organize it. Mm-hmm. And he had his own music guy, Ira Sankey, who's also very big in gospel music from that period. So you want to pick it up here? Should we share the trauma here?
The details of this are a little bit fuzzy. Is one version I read was that they were going to take a holiday in France. And so what's interesting is they were departing via boat from Chicago. Mm-hmm. So that they didn't go to the coast. They were able to take it all the way out the St. Lawrence. And you had heard something that he was actually kind of pairing this trip to France, or I don't know which one was first, but he was going to England as part of this trip in order to do some of the evangelistic stuff with the folks from Moody.
And he thought it would be great to send his family on a little holiday ahead of him.
Yeah.
Well, he wasn't planning on sending them ahead of him.
Yeah, they were supposed to all go together on this French vessel that was going, but because he was still learning how to recover from his enormous losses and deal with things with that real estate, he stayed a couple days later. I believe it was like 4 days, something along those lines. He goes. The family goes, and this is the part of the story I literally don't understand. At some point in the middle of the Atlantic, the boat that his wife and 4 children are on, which we were trying to pronounce this, the Via de Havre.
That's good. I like that.
Let's say that's right. It's
I
French.
agree.
It's a French vessel.
Yeah.
Collides with a British vessel named Loch Earn, and it says that the boat sank in 12 minutes with only his wife Anna surviving. And I guess there's an interesting, a well-known telegram that he receives that just begins, "Saved alone." So the 4 children perish in the shipwreck.
Yes.
Yeah, and so do you want to pick up the rest of the story here?
Well, there's also something maybe apocryphal where, as he decided he needed to join his wife, of course, after he got the cable. And as he was traveling, supposedly, he wrote the text to this wonderful hymn.
Yes.
As he crossed the actual site where the boat had sunk.
Yes,
and his daughters were
that's
buried.
the part I'd heard, that the line specifically that he wrote was, "When peace like a river attended my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll," which, understanding the context of where the wreck happened and the supposed where he wrote this, that makes a lot of sense, because when I think of sorrow, it's certainly been informed by this song, but I don't think my natural language would be seafaring language.
Right.
Yeah.
But and especially the rolling, sorrows like sea billows roll.
So he writes these lyrics in the process, and I assume when he returns, his very good friend Philip Bliss, who you were telling me a little bit. You want to tell us a little bit about Philip Bliss?
He's very big in gospel music, especially in America. And this, again, lest we forget to mention it, is one of the American hymns. We've had not that many totally American hymns, American song and American texts.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I think the connection here is, and I don't know, I didn't read anything necessarily if Spafford had been reading Julian and Norwich, but the line, the "It is well with my soul" connects to a line from Julian and Norwich where it's written, "And all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." That's what a lot of people see the connection.
There is no direct biblical allusion for this text.
Exactly,
so.
which is interesting because this one just seems to capture everyone, and I don't, I would think I knew the hymn before I knew the story, so obviously the hymn on its own merits stands, but when you learn the story, it takes on a whole other level of comfort and peace.
And again, I consider my move to the South sort of my rebirth, because I had never heard that hymn as a Lutheran in Wisconsin. I mean, it was coming south that I first heard it.
Yeah. And so to continue the story on, he goes and meets his wife there, and then, in the process composes a song. Eventually it is completed. He contacts his friend Bliss, who writes the music for that. He comes out. His suffering does not end there. He goes on to have 3 further children with his wife. The oldest of which he names after himself, Horatio, but that child at the age of 3 dies because of scarlet fever. Eventually, he becomes a little disillusioned with the church because he feels like his church is not supporting him. He leaves his Presbyterian church. He actually starts home church meetings with a movement that he has named aptly the Overcomers. Eventually, he decides that he's going to move to Jerusalem to form an American colony, and there he meets a bunch of Swedish Christians, and they begin doing witnessing to sort of the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews there in a non-proselytizing way, just wanted to serve people, and that's where they engaged in their charity work. Eventually, this is where the story continues to get stranger. They adopt a teenage boy when they're there, whose name I believe is Jacob Eliyahu, who is a Turkish Jewish boy living in Palestine, and they adopt him. And this is where it gets so crazy. Is this boy Jacob Eliyahu was known for being the young boy who went swimming in a little thing we'd call the Siloam Tunnel. Famous from Scripture, King Hezekiah builds this tunnel as a way to protect Jerusalem from an attack by Assyrians. It's enabled to get fresh water from a spring into the city behind the walls. The Pool of Siloam, which is obviously something very important to some members of our congregation who might have named a very important ministry in Nashville after at the Pools of Siloam. But Jacob, when he was in there and a schoolboy was swimming, had found this 8th century BCE inscription on the wall, which is very famous because it's one of the only inscriptions, because it's very much within Egyptian style. Egyptians write descriptions in these sort of glyphs on their walls about why this was built and who it was built for and all these things. That wasn't so much a Jewish thing, but there's this ancient sort of, they call it like primal Jewish script, Hebrew text, writing why this was built and how it was built. It's really interesting. It's in some museums now.
Well, that was totally news to me, so I'm glad you found that one.
Yeah. So ultimately, Spafford dies in 1888 of malaria.
And not very old.
Yeah, and he is buried in Mount Zion Cemetery there in Jerusalem. That's sort of his life. Now, we were talking about this too. Bliss is not a stranger to tragedy, although he really influential. He was converted in a revival meeting at age 12, was writing music pretty early. Although he was doing it from a music school that he had in New York, eventually had an encounter with Moody, who said, you know what you should do? You should be one of these traveling musical evangelists. And he decides to do this at age 36. And so he and his wife began doing this. And at the age of 38, in 1876, Moody calls to him and says, hey, come to Chicago, take a train over from New York to Chicago to come and participate in this evangelistic outreach we're doing here at the Tabernacle, the Moody Tabernacle. And in process, they have a train wreck and a fire, and they die in that wreck. It's just a never-ending series of tragedies. This song.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think I can never think of that hymn again without knowing how many layers of tragedy there were.
Yeah.
I mean, in the lives involved.
Absolutely. Yeah. We were in just sort of discussing the hymn. We were trying to even think. I just thought it was so odd how, the shipwrecks played such an important role. Yeah. In previous eras of the world, and I think of that all the way back to Scripture, where Paul cites all these shipwrecks he had in, and that's just something. While they certainly, like the Costa Concordia, toppled a few years ago, but our safety measures and all these things have radically changed it. But obviously, within our own modern history, things like the Titanic are hugely important, to the point that make billion-dollar movies out of them.
Sure.
But what would be our equivalent? Maybe plane wrecks, but even then, the safety record of these things, it's just not quite the same. The closest thing I guess I could think of, and I'm sure I'm missing something, I think of Roberto Clemente, the famous baseball player who was doing missionary work, was flying in small little planes into parts of Central America and died in a plane crash. That's someone that may be doing something a little similar,
Yeah, and doing something noble and good and tragically dying.
Yeah. Any thoughts about this hymn in general, musically, lyrically? Style?
Well, like we talked about, Great is Thy Faithfulness, there's that chromatic stuff going on,
Yes.
half steps, a lot of accidentals in the inner voices, which is a trademark of that gospel music of that era. It was extremely chromatic, and it's another one like Great is Thy Faithfulness again. Verse, chorus, verse, let's say refrain, verse, refrain, verse, refrain. Mm-hmm. Same words in the refrain each time. Musically, it's a lovely melody. It's not hymn-like. If you're comparing it again to Great is Thy Faithfulness, not a traditional hymn-like writing. I think it's a lovely, lovely piece, and it stands on its own.
Any thoughts on, particularly in the refrain, there's those echoey elements where it is well.
That's a gospel thing too, though.
Yeah.
You have a singer doing the solo, it is well, and then the congregation, well, it is well.
Yeah.
So it's very indicative of the time. But those three notes to me, bring back a ship's bell.
Yeah, it's haunting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just that da, da, da. And you'll see when I play the hymn as itself, I'm going to use the chime.
The chime in it, yeah.
Just for the three notes, yeah.
Yeah, in some ways, I doubt this was intentional, but it might have been a little throwback to the idea of a cantor, someone singing parts of the liturgy.
Right.
I think there's, maybe not explicit, but there's some allusion in there in that. It's very haunting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And haunting is the operative word.
Yeah, absolutely. So here it is. So this week, It Is Well With My Soul. What type of interpretation do you have for us?
I've got one that doesn't mess with it. It is beautiful.
Yeah.
It's by a woman named Eleanor Whitsitt. It's published from with Hope Publishing. It keeps the nature of the contemplative part of that hymn. No fancy footwork, thank goodness. It has a couple modulations, and those are always good. You like to go to a new key. It either elevates or does it changes for a verse. It just changes your expectations. I just think it's a nice is an overused word, but a lovely setting. It's very soothing to me.
So maybe this would be a good opportunity to talk about a component of organ music that maybe people aren't quite aware of, is that the organ's presence in the room it is in plays an enormous, I think I can't remember the exact phrasing you've used, part of the tuning of the organ, or not just the tuning,
voicing.
but the voicing of the organ is dependent on the room itself. And I wonder sometimes with songs like this that aren't as bombastic to say, that the room plays even a bigger role because there's something in the breath of a room that gives it. And unfortunately in this modality, sending it out, broadcasting it this way, we do our best to try to capture. I have miking that's meant to capture the elements of the room. In addition, we try to give the best possible representation, but it's not quite the same. So talk a little bit about that, the voicing.
Well, and the voicing, this may come as a surprise to people, but this is not a pipe organ. This is an electronic, digital organ. They've been developing beautifully, technologically, for many years. They've come a long way since we even got this one 20 years ago. But it's to emulate the sound of a pipe organ. Mm-hmm. And the room is always the component that finishes it off. You can have an organ that sounds fantastic, whether it's pipe or electronic. But you put it in a room with carpeting and drapes and lots of sound killing stuff, it loses its charm, it loses its voice. This has been always a good room for whatever its aesthetic flaws might be. Acoustically, this is a good room.
Yeah.
And the organ itself speaks well here. I'm glad that it works. I've enjoyed the time I've had lately being alone with the organ and just being alone in the room and reacquainting myself with it.
Yeah, there's to get into the nerdy sort of the nerdy tech area of this is I think what a lot of people are hearing when they hear a very interesting organ in person is what they're hearing is what's called late reflections. So, a sound goes, what lowers intelligibility in sound is late reflections. And so, when I'm hearing, even right now, even though we're relatively close to one another, the sound I'm hearing off your voice is not direct from your voice. It's from your voice. It's from this wall here. It's from these chairs here. It's all these things. And what lowers intelligibility is when there's a lot of complex surfaces around you. That means that I hear the sound from you quickly, but I hear the sound from that surface it arrives to my ear at a different point.
Reverberation.
Yeah, and that's the way things. So if you think about an organ within one of these grand cathedrals, you're hearing lots of late reflections, which means that there might be certain songs that have lowered intelligibility, but what it also does is it creates this, really, to use the word we used from a couple weeks ago, transcendent nature of this ethereal sound, particularly if it's an organ that's in the back.
Right.
I'm curious, are there spaces you've been to that you would just say, boy, the voicing of this organ in this space is just out of sight?
Oddly, one of my favorite organs in town, and it's pretty much the favorite of a lot of people, is the organ at First Baptist in Nashville. Mm-hmm. Lovely instrument that matches the room. It's a pipe organ, of course. The voicing, people still talk about that as being one of the premier instruments in Nashville. Not the largest. Maybe I might be misquoting 60 ranks, 50, 60 ranks, which is big. But then you've got West End United Methodist that has over 100 ranks. I think it's the biggest organ in the city. I'm sure I'll hear from somebody if it isn't. But and that's a lovely, lovely room, lovely building too. But my all-time favorite is the organ at First Baptist.
Now, have you had a chance to visit any of the great cathedrals or famed organs in that regard?
I have, but not for services. So it's one of those touristy things.
But you weren't able to hear the instrument when you were there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once when I was in Germany, the only time I'd been in Germany, I was the church itself was closed, but I could hear somebody playing inside. So I got sort of a contact high off of it somehow. I could hear. Yeah. I couldn't imagine how wonderful the reverberation must have been inside the cathedral, but I could still hear the ambient sound, and it was fabulous. But I've not been to many.
I've two I'd speak about very briefly. One is just, and I don't. It demonstrated this dynamic for me that I had not really experienced before, and I don't know whether it's a great scenario or not. But I would say Trinity Church in New York, which has the organ in the back. It's up in the back, and it creates this. It makes great use of the ceiling because the pipes, is because it's in a balcony and it's in the back. It is very high and it projects the sound up and off the ceiling, and so the organ, in many ways, especially when you're singing, surrounds you. It's not something you're singing into. You very much feel like you're singing with it.
Well, and often they put some of the other divisions, the swell division, that is the keyboards on the organ, they'll put them up front too. So you get that whole surround idea, and the room just marries it all beautifully.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The other one I would do, and again, this is more just a pure impressive thing, is about 7 years ago, we were in Iceland in Reykjavik, and we went into Hallgrímskirkja, which is you've probably seen pictures of it. It's a very interesting looking church that looks like it has those basalt columns going up to the top of it. And it has a organ that when you were in the actual nave itself is 5 or 6 stories tall. So when you're dealing with these different rank, in many places you're dealing with rank or on the left or right, and what's the horizontal scope of this? This is one of those column shaped organs that you might have a rank that's closer to the first floor, but you might switch to another one that's 5 floors up.
Yeah, the length. Yeah.
And
you're saying from base to the top.
Yes.
And those would be the base. the large pipes would be the base.
Yeah, and they're actually even dividing ranks where like separate floors might even have separate ranks, and it just we were there during one of the music weeks where they were having choral concerts and things like that. They had the most interesting design pews I'd ever seen that looked very much like a standard pew, padded, but the back was meant to swing back and forth, which was depending on what direction you wanted the pew to face.
Ooh.
So if you had a big, like when we were there, the choral concert and the organ concert, you wanted to see it, you could swing them and look at the organ in the back. but when it was time for worship and you wanted to look forward, you can swing them. Really interesting experience.
That is good because I've been in recitals and concerts where all the stuff is going on in the balcony, and you just get so tired of staring with your neck backwards.
So we'll dig into a little bit some of this stuff in the future. We've had discussions about we want to have a week where we talk about just organ technology in general, about the way different organs function, what the different stops and everything work on the organ to show people that. We can even dig as deep if people want to get into things like tracker organs and things like that.
I can't do much with that myself. So I tell you, I've been pretty much exclusively an electronic organ player all these years.
The organ players that blow my mind are the ones that play the manuals that there's a delay.
Oh, you got to adjust.
And I don't know how anyone could do that where they play and literally, seconds later it begins appearing out of the pipes. You would have to exist in a world where you don't get to appreciate your own music.
Well, and with a tracker, sometimes you're playing on one manual, and because you've what we call coupled it, you're playing on one manual, and it's because you've coupled it to the manual above. The manual above, the keys are moving at the same time you're playing them, and it's like gives you vertigo. It's like.
Well, we have wandered off a very interesting path, but we're going to return to the main path. And here it is, this week's interpretation of, I forgot the name.
It is well.
I wanted to say When Peace Like a River. I don't know.
That's what it's under. That's what it's listed as in our hymn book because it's the first line.
Well, there we go. So I was right and wrong.
You are right. You're right. Yeah.
This week's interpretation of It Is Well With My Soul.